You know how it is. You reach an endgame with an advantage, you try to calculate everything, the clock is ticking, and you end up drawing or even worse, losing. What I'm about to say might sound a little strange, but it's actually possible to play endgames without calculating everything. And the first step is something called schematic thinking, which is a really interesting idea that a lot of players don't even know about. So here's how schematic thinking works. There are endgames where you just can't calculate everything move by move because there are too many moves and too many options. So you don't really need to spend time calculating every forced line. Sometimes it's enough to know where your piece needs to end up. That's what schematic thinking is. Time and initiative matter more in the opening and the middle game. In the end game, what really matters is converting your advantage. And in this position, white is up a pawn, 3 pawns against 2. And there's also a structural edge. White's pawns are connected while black has 2 pawns split apart. So that's 2 pawn islands against 1. So you've basically got 2 advantages here, material and structural. The question now is how to turn that into a win. And if you try to calculate everything in a forced way, what would that actually look like in practice? For example, you might think something like, okay, I go rook to c6, then rook to a4, I go rook to c5, then rook to a3. But pretty quickly you realize there's just no clean way to calculate everything here. So there's another way to think about this, which is schematic thinking. Instead of calculating line after line, you basically picture where your piece needs to end up in order to win. Here, for example, if the rook gets to g6, you just take that pawn because there's no real way for the opponent to defend it unless the rook goes to h8. But if the rook goes to h8, then the pawn on e6 is hanging and your king suddenly gets a lot more freedom, right? So the real question becomes, well, how do I get my rook to g6? If you want to pause the video and think about it for a bit, it's actually a great exercise. White's a move here, and rook to a7 is like the way to reach g6 more or less by force. The idea is pretty simple, you know? After rook to h7, the king is going to try to hold the position, most likely with king to g5. So if we think about it in a simpler way, after rook check, I can bring my rook to g6, and there's literally no clear way for him to defend. Let's say the move e5, then rook to h7, and the king goes to g5. Now if you try rook check to get the rook into g6, he'll start invading. So you just go king to g3, rook to b1, rook to g7 check, king to f6, rook to g6 check, and we take the pawn. I mean, this is just a simple example, so you can see the basic idea behind schematic thinking. But it's a really powerful concept. Well, now I'm going to show a more complex case. Black to move here, and black wins, but just looking at the position, it's like not obvious at all how. And this is exactly where schematic thinking comes in. Instead of trying to force things move by move, you picture where your knight, your bishop, your king, and your pawn need to end up so you can actually make progress. Without that kind of mindset, it's really hard to find the path just by calculating everything sequentially, you know? So, to win this position, you've got to pull off a very specific maneuver. Get the knight to f5, get the pawn to h5, and get the bishop to c8 or b7. The idea is the knight shuts down the enemy king's escape, the pawn keeps the king from coming forward, and the bishop handles the pawn. The player basically does all of that work just to reach this exact moment. And I mean, look at the sequence. Bishop to f5, king to h7, knight to d6. It's slow, but it keeps squeezing the position until everything is finally in the ideal setup. First, the king steps away, then knight to d5 and bishop to c8, landing on the first square he wanted. Exactly like schematic thinking is supposed to work, right? And from here, it's just get the knight to f5 and finish it up with pawn to h5. So it goes bishop to d6, knight to e3, knight to f5 check, king to g4, and h5 check. And he's executed the whole maneuver and reached the exact setup you planned. That's the essence of schematic thinking. You can't calculate everything by force, but you picture where your pieces need to end up and you just keep maneuvering until you get there. Now, we get to the most interesting part of the game. The player starts activating the king to create mating threats, literally marching it across the board until the king gets to g1. So I'm going to fast forward the moves to the instructive moment. King to e4, king to f3, king to f2. the opponent answers with bishop to c1, keeping that bishop on defense the whole time to guard the pawn on f4, because if that pawn isn't protected, the conversion gets way easier. And then we get king to g1 and bishop to e3. This moment is really interesting because it's black to move, and black actually has a forced checkmate. If you want to pause and think for a bit, it's totally worth it. Actually, that doesn't really make sense since it's already in the thumbnail. So let's keep going. Black plays king to h1, and from there, it's basically impossible to stop the mate threat with bishop to g2. For example, if the opponent promotes to a queen, basically bishop to g2 hits the board anyway, and the game's gonna end in a really nice knight and bishop mate, with the pawn contributing to the final net. So that's it for today's video. Yeah, it's a little shorter than usual, but I'm in the middle of moving into a bigger place right now, so things are a bit chaotic. Next week, we'll be back to the normal schedule. And go ahead and drop a comment below with any topic you'd like to see on the channel. Openings, endgames, tactics, whatever. I read all the comments, and whenever I can, I try to make the videos you guys ask for. I'll leave the last video I posted right here on the screen. And now comes the classic line on this channel. Click now, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.